Thanks for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to giving this talk and also to the interactions with you. It's a new talk. I hope it is not too long. If not, I have to cut so that we have enough time also for the discussion. It's called From Climate Change to Biodiversity and Back. So, my content of the talk. The first part, I would like to very briefly, in generic terms, talk about the influence of climate on biodiversity. I'm not going to give a talk on how climate affects biodiversity here at Senckenberg, because this is really your stuff. But I will show you maybe an interesting case study from the region around Leipzig, actually 2 case studies. In the second one, I would like to talk about how, in the face of climate, biodiversity may lend stability to ecosystems, preventing them from degradation or change. And in the last part, I hope I'm getting there, is I would like to turn it around and talk about how biodiversity itself can feed back on the climate. Little disclaimer, you will hear a lot about trees and forests because I like trees and forests and I study them. It will be mostly work from my own working group that I'm leading with Alexandra Weigelt. And we are starting with that topic. So, you all know this map. It is the famous Bartlett map of plant diversity. And I'm only bringing this here to say, this is first principles that, of course, there is a relationship between biodiversity and climate. There is more biodiversity near the equator than polewards. And it's also not only about the biodiversity itself, like how many species per hectare or so, but it's of course also different types of species that are growing and living in the tropics. So it's completely obvious that if climate changes, that also biodiversity changes. This is really what you're studying, in particular at Big F. So I'm cutting short here. Instead of showing you my lectures on this topic and bore you with all the papers that you already know, I'm presenting you a little home story. This is the place where I live, south of Leipzig. This is my house here. And here is a little area, it's still a meadow, soon to be developed. What we have found in the last 2 years, 2 new insects, is the praying mantis, Gottesanbeterin, arrived this year. We've seen that animal for the first time. And since 2 years, I haven't found a translation, the Weinhähnchen, which is also a sub-Mediterranean species that sounds as if you are on vacation in Tuscany. So the soundscape has changed in the place where I live. Every day I hear climate change. There is no way I can escape from this. My surroundings are different than they have been when we've built this house. Then, my wife is a filmer. My wife is a filmer and she produces for the Garden series of MDR. And she wanted to portray this wonderful butterfly here, kleiner Fuchs in German. This is a species that has, and we only learned this afterwards because we knew that we found the species early on when we moved in around 2009-10. But we couldn't find it afterwards. It's a species with a temperate to boreal distribution. We learned then that we have to really drive up the mountains to find this butterfly. So she went all the way to Oberwiesenthal in Saxony to be able to find this animal. So we have also not only gains, but we have also losses. And the balance of these 2 processes at the moment seems to be on the negative side. That unlike I've put in here, we have 2 plus and 1 minus. It's typically the other way around, that we are losing species because of climate change. You have all seen probably this figure, at least many of you, which is the summary of the IPBES report, and it attempts an attribution of the reason why we are losing biodiversity on our planet. Please look at this reddish brownish color. So by and large, 15% of losses in biodiversity or reasons for extinctions are attributed to climate change. In the IPCC report, Working Group 2 from 2022, there are some estimates of how biodiversity would change, or the number of extinctions that we have to expect at different scenarios, plus 1.5 degrees Celsius, 3 and 5. And there you can see numbers that are somehow worrisome, up to 48% of the species lost. But you can also see that there's a huge uncertainty. It always starts at 3 and then goes up to these big numbers. So we don't really know, but we are expecting, according to the models and the scenario models, that we might lose a lot of species. How does this then, and this will become important later, how does this translate into how the communities are composed? Will we lose biodiversity in the places where we go or where we do our research? I would like to cite a paper by a colleague of mine from iDiv. This is Shane Blows in the group of Jonathan Chase. They have analyzed time series data from the Biotime database, 239 studies with a lot of time series of observations, biodiversity observations over time. And of course, they asked the questions whether we see these predicted declines in biodiversity over time. So how does species richness change? But they also looked how the composition of these communities changed over time. And they did this for a number of different ecosystem types. So walk you through this briefly. There are different biomes, the polar biome, the temperate biome, and the tropical biome. And then in these biomes, they looked for different ecosystem types, so oceans, land ecosystems, and freshwater ecosystems. The upper panels refer to changes in species richness, and the lower panel refers to changes in community composition. And what you can see, if you look at where these distributions are in relationship to the dashed line. The dashed line is the 0 line, no change. What you basically see is that species richness has not significantly changed, and if at all, it has changed to the positive. Whereas if you look at the lower, what you can see is that the dashed line is far to the left, and most of these distributions are quite far away from it. So that indicates a significant change in community composition. So we should not actually expect to find fewer species in our ecosystems, but we shall expect to find different ones. Irrespective of the fact that we, of course, will have, due to climate change, extinctions. But these are two different things in different scales. So now I'm jumping from the global to the local scale. I invite you to visit some of the sites that we're investigating near Leipzig. You all know that our climate is changing, and this figure is shown quite often because it is a really nice way of identifying extreme years in terms of climate. What you can see is basically an ordination of anomalies in precipitation on the x-axis and anomalies in the temperature on the y-axis. So if you go to the left upper box, this is the place where there are conditions that plants do not like. It is particularly dry and it's particularly warm in combination. And we have had a very extreme year already in 2003. This is the red dot to the upper left. That was indeed an extreme event, but then we had in 2018 and 19 two of these years in a row. And this will become important in a minute. So that's new. And this is not just by chance. This is because we do have climate change. We are already at a level of plus 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the model expectations are that extreme droughts that used to occur only every 50 years nowadays occur every 9 years. And of course, if we will have higher temperatures in the future, that will even change to the worse. So this is how it looks like, the temperature and the precipitation in a climate station near Leipzig. You can see the very hot years, 2018, 19, and 20, and 22 in a row, and also very dry years towards the end of these series. These are the red dots. There are climate statistics for Saxony. In these 5 years from 2018 to 2022, we had a plus in relationship to the time from 1961 to 1990 of 20% of hours of sunshine. We have a deficit in precipitation of 464 liters per square meter, and the water balance deficit, because there's also evaporation and transpiration, is 851 liters. And to make this number speak to you, this is 2 years of transpiration of a normal temperate forest. So out of these 5 years, 2 years basically no transpiration possible because of this deficit. This is massive and has never been observed before like this. When I came to Leipzig in 2010, I happened to inherit a crane, a canopy crane that is in the floodplain forest of Leipzig. Due to the fact that we were successful with our application for the Biodiversity Center iDiv, we also had the finances to rescue it, to my great pleasure, and also to instrument it. What you can see here is all sorts of sensors for climate variables, phenocameras, etc. That is all logged and sent to the cloud, and we can sit at home and see how whether our trees have fever or not. Since it's a floodplain forest, it is a very species-rich forest, so we were able to study 5 different tree species and enough replication at the same time, and could also, of course, replicate it. We were also looking at stem flux rates of 24 species. You see the canopy crane from above. You see also this black line. The black line is due to the fact that there are railroad tracks, so that crane can move 120 meters, and of course it can also turn around, so it covers approximately 1.5 hectare. In 2018, I got a message from my colleague, Rolf Engelmann, who was the canopy crane expert back then, also doing the technical things. And he sent this picture to me saying, "Christian, I've never seen this before, look at this." And what we saw in 2018, large branches like this one, like 5 centimeters thick, bending over. Typically, you would only expect leaves to do this under a drought. But obviously, the turgor loss was so high that, this wood became soft, hanging over and exposing the lower surfaces. Very unusual. We've only found one evidence in Central Europe for such kind of a phenomenon from the Rhine area. So in these 2 years, unfortunately not before, we were able to measure stem flux. You see different colors. The different colors are for different tree species. 5 ones here, not going into the details, but there is, of course, oak, typical for floodplain forest. There's ash. There is also Tilia, lime tree, there's hornbeam, and there is also a maple tree, sycamore maple. So in the first year, 2018, the first drought year, what you see is that over the course of the season, in the beginning of the season, everything was still fine, but then towards the later season, the stem flux, so how much water is transported through the wood, went down by approximately 50%. Not by all species, but by most species. Interestingly, in the next year, there was a very slow start. So transpiration started much later. There are a number of reasons for that. We don't know exactly which one is true. Maybe the soil water reserves were low and there was still a need for more precipitation. Or it could also be that the vessels in the stem were cavitated and were not operational for water transport. And then there was a summer depression after a slight recovery. So you can see that 2019 doesn't look very good for these three species here. We then wanted to ask, okay, this is just a few trees around the canopy crane. How representative is this for the entire forest area we're working in? So we went to plots that we have installed there and took tree cores. This is Rolf Engelmann taking tree cores from a tree. And I think I need to drink a little bit. So what we did is the following, to make you understand what you see here. There is a zero line, this is a dashed line, and that zero line is defined by the normal growing conditions in years that we did not identify as drought years, so the normal years. Then there were also some, let's say, droughts that occurred earlier that clearly were droughts, but not as extreme as the ones in 2018 and 19. So when we look at this figure, we look at these little dots. If they are sitting directly on this zero line, that means there is no difference from a normal year. And the first one is a normal drought year. The second is 2018, which is an extreme drought year, and 2019. So what we can see here is that in the first year, first of all, what we see is these are the blue dots. In the normal drought years, there's no difference. In the normal drought year, these trees grow as always. They are not bothered, which is also not very surprising because it's a floodplain forest. And of course, there is a little bit more water than in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, for example. And in the second year, in 2018, also in oak and in maple, nothing really happens. But then in the second year, 2019, the second extreme year in a row, you can see how growth really goes down. The ash, all the way to the right, is a bit more sensitive. It is already affected in 2018, but then even more so in 2019. So the second drought year is really critical, and it's also referred to as a carry-over effect. We were interested to learn to what extent the fact that in 2018 there was not a difference from a normal year is maybe due to the fact that there are still some reserves. So maybe the trees had stress, and we've seen already that the stem flux was going down, but growth doesn't tell us yet because there are still some reserves that this tree can rely on. So we also looked at a proxy for drought stress, which is a isotopic ratio. The carbon in the CO2 that the plants take up can be composed of different isotopes. There is a heavy isotope, a heavy carbon, 13C, and the normal carbon, 12C. The 13C, the heavy one, is approximately 1% of the carbon, and the rest is 99%. What I've drawn here for you is the epidermis of a leaf, and you can see the opening, which is a stomata. Plants take up CO2, and they lose through these stomata the water. The R stands for an enzyme that's important for photosynthesis. This is the one that grabs the CO2 and then channels it into the physiology to produce sugars in the end. Now the 12C is much lighter, it moves faster, and the rubisco also has a higher affinity to the lighter carbon. So when there is ample of CO2 available because the stomata are open, then basically the rubisco can choose. It will always take, or preferably take, the lighter one. So the resulting sugars in the end are lighter isotopically. If the stomata are closed, I say it in simple words, then the concentration goes down and the rubisco has to take in the end what is there. So it also has to take the heavier one, which results in heavier sugars. And that you can measure with a mass spectrometer. So when we do this, we see actually something very similar as before. The same logic of the graphics that I'm showing here, higher numbers mean the proxy more towards closed stomata, towards a response to drought stress. In 2018, in oak and maple, really nothing happens, but then in the second year, in the second critical year, you can clearly see a significant effect towards drought stress. In ash, it starts a bit earlier, which basically means, yes, in the first year, that site could somehow buffer it, but in the end, in 2019, this thing was really subject to stress. Interestingly, a colleague of mine from Jena, Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry, Anna Bastos, looked at something very similar with remote sensing. She was able to quantify something that's called EVI, or Enhanced Vegetation Index. That's a proxy for the activity of the vegetation. And she did this for all of Europe, and these are the numbers here for Central Europe, where you can see also an anomaly of temperature on the x-axis. So the warmer it gets, the less active is the vegetation. There is an expected relationship. But the year 2019 is outside the 95 confidence limit. So there is something different going on in 2019 than elsewhere. And this is also a proof for this carryover effect that 2 extreme years in a row really cause damage to our trees. That's that one here. Okay, beetles now. We have the possibility to install beetle traps in our canopy trees, thanks to the Canopy Crane, and there is a project funded by iDiv and led by Martin Schlegel that has looked at this. A master thesis based on these data could clearly see that already in 2018 the populations of bark beetles, and this is the green bar, this is percentages of different taxonomic groups of beetles, was really jumping up. So it's a very sensitive system even in the first year of stress, and even though there was a very strong stress level visible in the trees, the beetles already responded to that. And these are particular beetles that feed on, or bark beetles that are specialized on ash trees. And this is what happened then. So the ash trees are now dying. We are basically losing them from our forest. You can clearly see that there are some trees without leaves. This is not autumn, this is in the middle of summer. They're just dying off. And the little picture that you see here is woodpeckers trying to get at the larvae of the bark beetles and peeling off the bark. And it looks like this. Anyway, some good news in between. There were also other results from this study. Over the time of 2 years, in actually only 18 trees, this group found 566 different beetle species, and 114 of them were on the red list. 566 beetle species is 8% of all the beetles that are described for Germany on 18 trees in our floodplain forest. This spectacular number. Some of these beetle species are tree species specific, so they have particular host species. This is a Venn diagram that shows how many beetles were caught on just one species. 3 were only analyzed here, how many on 2, and how many on 3. Now these numbers in bold print here doesn't mean that these are all completely host specific, because these traps just basically catch everything that's flying around. Some of them might be specific, others not. But in this population of 77 beetle species caught in the ash, there are certainly some that only occur on ash. And if ash disappears from the forest, they will be gone as well. We had a closer look based on a very cool data product from Jörg Müller and colleagues that identify host specificity of Xylophagus or Xylobizontic beetles. And this way we could use our data and map it onto this, which allowed us to say which species are really species specific. And if you only go, this is also a Venn diagram, the same thing, but just for 5 different species. If you go around the circle and you take the outer ones, we are counting 47 of these beetle species are host tree specific, which is 53% of all of the beetles in this collection. So if one of the tree species would die, some of these would be really gone. And the one that is most important here, some of you might have expected this, is oak. For ash, it would only be 5 species going. However, also oak is on danger. These are sightings of fierce enemies of oak. They are already waiting for oak to be weakened by whatever climate extreme to maybe take this next. So we are all a little bit afraid, because then the last one of our typical floodplain forest species is also gone. So extreme climates, not only in 2018, there was a series of very extreme years. 5 years in a row, 2 years of transpiration is missing. Transpiration starts shutting down slowly in the first year, and then we saw a very poor recovery of transpiration in the second year. We see clear carryover effects, so that second extreme year matters. That already has caused one of the species to go probably locally extinct. The process is going on. It had the highest stress values, and it also had already a fungal infection, the ash decline, and that was then basically easy prey for the bark beetles. And we are expecting local extinctions, and they may indeed harm the biodiversity, the very remarkable biodiversity in our site. So here is the forest around the canopy crane. Everything that's in red, this is with a laser scan, everything that's in red is ash. So just imagine that these will be gone sometime. As you can imagine, this will really change for quite a while the structure of this forest, and these ash trees will be replaced by other species. At the moment, this is maple, but maybe in future, when climate changes, it will be completely different species. There's this very cool paper by Mette et al., Tobias Mette. This is a climate analysis. They were searching for climate analogs of a particular place in Germany called Roth in Franconia under different climate scenarios. And the question they were asking is, to which climate in 2000 anywhere in Europe is the climate at this particular site similar in 2020, 40, etc.? And then you see different colors for these different future years. And when we go to the end of the century, under a particular scenario, in this case plus 4 degrees Celsius, we would expect to have the climate of northern Italy. So Mediterranean to sub-Mediterranean climate in this place. So it's quite likely that the species that we have in our tree flora would not be fit to fill this niche. So it is a good idea to look around how tree species can perform. The resident ones of our tree flora, but also maybe the ones of neighboring floras under these future climates. And with this, I would like to introduce another platform, which is the Arbofan platform south of Leipzig, where we planted 100 different tree species on a grid of 6 by 6 meters. You can see it from above, 5 times replicated, and I'm trying to start this now. This is a laser scanned ride through this arboretum that you get a little bit of an impression. So these are all the different tree species. Of course, they have different growth rates because they have different functional traits. Some of them are pioneers, some of them are late successionals, and we can access them very well. We can also access the root systems very well to make studies on, for example, the functional root traits, etc. Very convenient platform. Stop it and go to the next slide. This is the design. Everything was said already. We don't have quite 100 species, 94 at the moment, but still enough to keep us busy. And what you can see here is the 5 different blocks with the replicated species placed randomly. What we did, we didn't dare to core these trees because they're still a little bit young and vulnerable. What we did instead is that we looked at the shoot increments over the last couple of years, and this we could trace back to 2016. We could do this for 71 tree species, different numbers of replicates for availabilities. And with this, we could also, of course, then look at the growth rates during the years of the extreme droughts, 2018 and 19, but also the years before and the years after. We could then calculate from this what we call growth resistance. So again, the zero line would be the reference years before the drought. And if it is below the zero line, then it would be lower growth rates. Of course, everything standardized to make these tree species comparable. And then we compare the earlier periods with 18, 19, and 20. And what we can see, at least for the conifers, that there are clear pictures that functional traits that we can also interpret have a relationship to this growth resistance. So for conifers, we can say that the ones with cheaper leaves, meaning a higher specific leaf area, suffer more, and conifers with vessels that are, that cavitate more easily, typically the bigger ones, also have this negative signal. So we can try to explain this behavior of drought resistance or vulnerability using the traits, and what we see here is that the ones that tend to have a higher productivity are the ones that are more susceptible. The same we can also see for isotopes. We have been collecting leaves of all trees since 2018. This is the first batch of results, only got this 3 days ago. And what you can see is a lot of data for 71 different tree species of isotopic measurements. If the bars go to the right, it indicates drought stress during the dry years in relationship to the reference year, in this case 21. If it goes to the left, then the trees are unimpressed basically by the drought. And also here we see that taking this as a measure of a drought response is related to a leaf functional trait that has something to do with growth rates and productivity. The higher the leaf nitrogen concentration, the higher typically the growth rates. But what I find most exciting about the study, and we are still analyzing this, is that we have really drastically different response types in these species. We categorize them into 4 groups. The sufferers that suffer in all the drought years. So in 18, 19, and they also do not recover in 20. Then there are the resistors that are sitting on the zero line. So no change to the situation before, nothing changes, completely unimpressed. The recoverers that have a dip, or they withstand in 2018, then carryover effect, they are suffering in 2019, and when the situation gets a little bit better, 2020 was not so bad, they could recover. And then the declining resistors that first resisted, stayed at 0, nothing changes, and then went down. And we listed all the different tree species here, and just 2 things I would like to highlight. The conifers are not doing very well. Most of them belong to the sufferers. So they are most vulnerable at our site to these drought events. The second that I'd like to highlight, everything that is blue are some species that are either from the sub-Mediterranean or have ranges extending into that climate, and they tend to be more on the side of the groups that resist to some extent, or at least recover. And then there are some stars here, future trees that suffer, that you can Google for future trees, and you find as recommendations to be planted in cities, but that do not really very well. Like cedar, for example, or Douglas fir is not really doing very well. So that was a surprise for us. So summary to this one, we have this new research arboretum where we study the behavior of many, many tree species at the same time. We see that tree species with traits associated with fast growth tend to suffer most. Which actually is, I think, good news for modelers, could be easily implemented because these kinds of traits, as leaf nitrogen or SLA, you have all as parameters in your models. And then there is this high diversity of response types. I've just mentioned that. Okay. Now we have all these stresses accumulating, and the question is, to what extent can biodiversity help with resisting to that? So far we had looked at a mature forest and individual trees. What is the effect of mixing trees for that purpose? We had already in the early 2000s, and actually even earlier, reports from forests suddenly dying, like here in Arizona. This has been mapped worldwide by a group of scientists, and what you can see here is a map of occurrences of these kinds of sudden death events of entire forests, turning brown. The yellow to red dots are the more recent ones, and the bluish ones are some that go back to 1980, for example. And what we can see is it has started in the Sahel zone, but also there are some blue dots in other places, in particular in southwest US. In Central Europe, it's pretty reddish to yellow. So actually only recently did we have come across these kinds of problems. And you have seen all pictures like this. These are the Harz Mountains after the drought years. This is in 2020, all dead. At least for the forest tree sector, big catastrophe. Question could be asked, would this look different if that was not a monoculture of spruce trees, but a mixture? And this is what we were asking in this paper. This is an overview opinion paper led by Miguel Mahecha. In the top you see net primary productivity changing over time in a high diversity ecosystem. The red is the drought shock or heat shock or whatever shock. And then lower down you have a low diversity system. And then you look at the lines, you see a lower dip in the high diversity system and a complete recovery, meaning a high resilience of that system, whereas in the lower you see much deeper decline and then no complete recovery, or at least very slow. Is that so? There's this very cool study by Anderegg from the US. They looked at stations of eddy covariance towers that can measure fluxes of ecosystems, water fluxes, CO2 fluxes, and you can use these kinds of data to quantify the sensitivity of these fluxes to drought, water pressure deficit. So you can quantify them with respect to drought vulnerability. And they could explain this vulnerability or sensitivity to drought by two xylem traits, hydrological traits related to the water transport. I'm not going into the details here, but that was the first time that someone showed that, in fact, the diversity of these different traits is important for the resistance or the sensitivity of such ecosystems. A colleague of mine, Helge Brühlheide, established approximately 12 years ago an experiment. I'm part of this research group, but it was really his thing to establish this. In two valleys in China, central China, a tree plantation with gradients from monocultures to really high diverse mixtures, to study the influence of diversity on all sorts of performances of these forests. Growth rates, transpiration, decomposition, and whatnot. That's how it looks like. If you have a closer look, you see a little bit of this checkerboard in that forest structure. It's not very clearly visible, but these are all different patches of forests differing in their diversity. And a PhD student of mine, Florian Schnabel, looked at the inventory data and was able to check the growth rates of these trees, and he was able to calculate over the years the stability of these growth rates. So basically meaning if a forest grows always at the same rate over the time, then it has a high stability. If it jumps up and down, it has a low stability. That's also meaning that it's susceptible to climatic changes. And what he found is that, and please look at the colors first, that if we go from left to right to higher values of community stability, the dots tend to be bluish. That means they have a higher diversity. But the main driver of this was the fact that these trees would grow asynchronously over time. So they didn't have the same growth behavior, so they were basically averaging each other out in their behavior. So it's sort of a portfolio effect that stabilizes the growth rates of the entire community. And that was also related to the functional trait diversity. So the more diverse the trees were in terms of their functional traits, the higher this asynchronic behavior and the higher the stability. This is a super cool new method that was developed by Thea Kattenborn, also from University of Leipzig. He places phenocams into canopies that take pictures all the time, and then you can see how the leaves move. And then he uses AI methods, so it's training a CNN to be able to, basically measure the angle changes over the course of a day. And if you have a closer look, you can see that towards midday, the leaves tend to droop a little bit, and then they go up again. And this can be related to a drought response. So if they have little water, and if they are really stressed, they would hang down. And if that's not the case, if they have enough water, they would keep the leaves more or less straight, at least over the day. So it's not sleeping movements here, but it's really related to the hydrology. And he found, at least in a preliminary study in a diversity experiment, that one species here, as an example, sycamore maple, would have a lower movement of the leaves if it was surrounded by different tree species. So that means that this environment, this biotic environment, would buffer somehow the effect of increasing temperature over the day, and it would stabilize the hydrological conditions of these trees, which is really cool. Only a pilot experiment, but I wanted to show this little nice image. I think I skip over the next one and I move directly to the experiment itself. This is the medy experiment in Saxony-Anhalt, south of Halle. That was established by Nico Eisenhower, and it's a typical tree diversity experiment, but I will tell you in a second that it's not entirely typical. So we have gradients from 1 to 2 to 4 tree species planted together in these patches. The special thing about this experiment that it does not only manipulate the tree species richness, but also the potential richness of mycorrhizal species that are forming a symbiosis with trees. You can see here that we have these gradients of 1, 2, and 4 species, 10 replicates each, and then we have the same series for only species with a mycorrhizal type that's called arbuscular mycorrhiza, and then another set with ectomycorrhiza. It's not important now what these actually are, but they are different. And this is the species behind these different associations, because it's known which kind of tree species goes with which kind of symbiotic fungal species. To the left you see the ones with AM, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and to the right you see the ectomycorrhizal fungi. Ectomycorrhizal fungi tend to have a higher biomass, and they are also more efficient in water transport, whereas arbuscular mycorrhiza are known to be more flexible, can respond more easily to changing conditions, and they are more drought resistant, so they can withstand lower water potentials in the soil. So they are really different also with respect to the hydrology. Some results. This is the basal area increments, so how the trees get bigger over time. They're still young in 2016. In the period prior to the drought, so it's pre, during the drought, red, and in the post-drought period. This is a young forest, and the growth rates tend to increase in that period of life. So this should actually go up. It did not because of the drought. So there was really not a very high resistance at all in these forests. They really suffered in terms of growth to the drought. And they stayed at low levels in 2019 and 20, and then they slowly recovered in 2021. These different gray shades are the diversity levels, and you can already see that there is not a very majestic pattern visible here. And this is exactly what we find. So the blue line is the ectomycorrhizal, and then the green line is the arbuscular mycorrhizal. And in none of the two, where you have only tree species associated to one of the fungi, did we see a positive relationship of biodiversity and resistance, or of biodiversity and resilience, meaning the recovery towards 2021. Only if there was the mix present of the two mycorrhizal species, EM and AM, did we find a positive relationship also with respect to tree species. Also very fresh results in preparation, a little bit disappointing, but pointing to the fact that mycorrhizal diversity might be really very important here. I said this already. So, tree species richness stabilizes ecosystem fluxes and growth in the face of climate variability. It stabilizes productivity / activity. That was the one that I was not showing, and it reduces probably stress. So far, there is very little evidence that tree diversity lends resistance against extremes, shock moments, climatic ones. But maybe mycorrhizal diversity is important here, and I would like to utter an opinion. It is not, think of the study of Shane Blaus and Jonathan Chase. It is not very likely that due to climate change, alpha diversity will dramatically be different in the future. There will always be some species coming in and keeping levels high. But what we've seen here is a good recommendation for changing our forest management to enrich the really species-poor systems that we are currently having, especially in Central Europe, and that it may help to stabilize them, to plant more different species. How am I time-wise? I haven't...
Just go on, it's fascinating, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the explanation. This will be a shorter one here, and then we'll have it done. So biodiversity affecting climate. This is ugly. This is the energy balance equation that actually is part of most of the biogeochemical models out there, or the Earth system models. It is absolutely not interesting to look at the details of these equations at all. What we have in an energy balance is the radiative part, so it's a short-wave radiation, a long-wave radiation. We have sensible heat losses, we have latent heat losses, which is related to transpiration or evaporation, and we have storage. The only thing that's relevant here is that there are some of the parameters that are highlighted with yellow. And this is, for one, an albedo, so how much of the shortwave radiation is reflected, sort of the mirror function of an ecosystem. And then all sorts of resistances that have to do something with how warm air is transported out of an ecosystem, or how water vapor is transported out of an ecosystem to get rid of the energy. And they are all heavily affected by features and functional traits of plants, all sorts of different things: leaf angles, leaf reflectances, leaf hairiness, the leaf size, you name it. It's not important what, but what it clearly shows is that the vegetation itself is really a major driver of the Earth's energy balance. And every good model has to somehow incorporate this. Of course, not in all this detail, but to some extent, you will find it everywhere. Now, when we ask about, and this is how I try to structure my thinking of this, the feedback of vegetation to the climate, back to the climate. What Earth system modelers typically thinking of is the left-hand side arrangement, where you have strongly contrasting ecosystem types, for example, an agricultural field and a forest. And they do behave differently, as I will show in a second, but this is textbook knowledge. This is how my colleagues in the meteorology department in Leipzig think about diversity. That's diversity for them. Forest and no forest. How we think about diversity as ecologists and biodiversity scientists is more like the parts to the right-hand side. So we see a forest and we resolve it down to the fact that there are different species in this forest and that this may actually matter, not just the mere fact that this is a forest. And the same can, of course, hold to different crops. And then not only them being different taxonomically, but also them behaving very differently. So they can express different responses to stresses that can have a feedback to the atmosphere. So let me give you a little bit of example how this could reflect on the climate. There is actually at the moment not much out there to study this. This is really a new research field and a very exciting one. Going back to China, I've introduced this experiment to you. One rather trivial thing, but that is potentially relevant for the climate, is the fact that diverse forests grow better for a number of reasons. That means also that they sequester more carbon, so they take out more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is good, as you know. Maybe a bit more interesting, because that is established knowledge I just presented, we know this for a while. We distributed temperature sensors in these different types of forest, little hobo loggers. They record the temperature at a rather high frequency, so we can have a look at how the diversity of these stands controls the microclimate inside these forests. It's not yet exactly a feedback to the climate, but it's a component of this. And what we found is this. What you can see, let's first look at the upper panel. This is temperature measurements, and the panels are different hours of the day. And each of these stripes is a little plot with an x-axis that is not readable, going from 2 to 16 species. So it's a diversity gradient in each of these little stripes. And what you can see is, let's start at noon here, is that in diverse forests, temperature is lower. But at night, it's exactly the reverse. It stays a little bit warmer in the more diverse one. Basically just meaning that diverse forests are better at buffering the climate, the variation of climate in the course of the day. Very interesting. And the same happens at a monthly scale. So this is one of the first 2 studies that has ever shown a direct effect of diversity on the microclimatic buffering. Now back to the larger scale. This is really textbook knowledge. It's a region in Australia where studies have been conducted because people realize that on the right-hand side, where there is some sort of a shrubby forest, that there are more clouds emerging than on the left-hand side. This is not just by chance, clouds moving along, but it happens to be like this. And this has to do with vegetation features. It is described in an early paper by Chambers. And as I said before, it's a textbook knowledge. It's in the plant ecology or ecosystem ecology textbook of Terry Chapin. Very nice one. So you see to the right-hand side the natural vegetation. This has a lower albedo. It has also a higher roughness, a better coupling with the atmosphere, which together also, and the fact that they have deeper roots and take up all the water, they can produce warm air that moves up and then eventually produces rain. And because these 2 systems are coupled and the agricultural crops are on top also irrigated, the forests suck the moist air from left to right and produce their own clouds that then eventually will also rain. Now, the role of diversity for climate. I have shown you an example where there was a potentially direct effect of diversity on the microclimate and maybe also then as a feedback on the macroclimate. But there's also a second pathway that is maybe more important. The fact that we have a diverse forest may make this forest more stable against climate change, and it will keep it as being a forest. And we have just seen in the example before that forests are rather good for, you know, the water cycle, producing clouds, and having a negative feedback basically on climate change. So it's not the forest diversity influence per se feeding back on the climate, but landing stability to stay a forest. When we look at these papers by Lenton, identifying potential tipping points, then of these tipping points there are at least 3 where it says that the existence of forests might be threatened and that this might serve as a tipping point. So tropical forests turning into savannas, etc., or boreal forests turning into grasslands, or whatever lichen deserts emerge. So that seems to be really important for the climate system, and maybe it's there where diversity is most important. And there's this unbelievably cool paper by Zakrzewski that has made a model experiment directly on this question, and this is my last result slide for you, but I would like to walk you briefly through this. That has been already published in 2016, really pioneering work based on the LPJ model. And what you can see here is a little experiment with tropical forest. You see biomass on the y-axis and time, actually quite a large time span with hundreds of years on the x-axis. And they looked at their model forests, diverse forests that they were able to produce in their model experiment. They are able to do this, and then they looked, or they applied a drought. Yeah, they subjected this to a drought, a very heavy one. And we have different versions of the model. The blue line is a highly diverse model. So it's parameterized with many, many players that are very diverse. Then a low diversity model, and as a reference also a standard model. And the important part here is that you can see that no matter what kind of model we take, they are all suffering from the drought event. They all go down. But it's only the blue one, the high diversity model, that expresses some sort of recovery. So expresses resilient behavior and remains a forest and does not turn into something different, not in a shrubland. And the most likely explanation for this is that in this pool of tree species that form this forest, there are some species, there is a potential of species that can operate under drought conditions and form a new type of forest that still is a forest and functions as one and has not become a savanna, whereas the low diversity forest is not able to do this. So that's a very important finding, and I'd like to summarize here. So the meteorological theory predicts multiple pathways of vegetation control on the climate. So vegetation has to be part of good models. We have to distinguish different types of diversity, vegetation type diversity, forest versus agriculture, but more importantly in future also the diversity of these vegetation types itself. So how many tree species do we have? We saw that diverse forests are able to sequester more carbon, at least in this experiment, in the plantations they were able to do so. They are also able to buffer diurnal temperature variation, colder during the day, warmer at night, and forests may stabilize, or forest diversity may stabilize forests as a vegetation type so that forests can maintain its important buffering role in the climate system. And I think this is probably the most important effect of diversity in this field. Okay, so obviously we have to think these two crises together. The climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are tightly linked. It's the same thing, it's two sides of the same coin, and the big panels, IPBES and IPCC, figured it out already, had joint working group meetings, and there's also a very nice publication on this already, and we at Leipzig are very inspired by that. We've teamed up with atmospheric scientists and meteorologists to work on this. We've submitted an excellence cluster proposal, wish us luck, and also a CRC proposal, which with the name Biodiversity Buffers for Climate Extremes. Not yet funded, but we're working hard towards it because we find this really important to view this together. And also, policy has responded accordingly. Of course, we're not there yet, but the big programs, the EU Green Deal, looks at both things. It looks at climate and also biodiversity at the same time for a good reason. And we have our own German program basically rooted in the EU Green Deal, which is called Aktionsprogramm Natürlicher Klimaschutz. Basically the idea, if we build or restore ecosystems in such a way that they are helping us with climate resistance and resilience, then typically this will also lead to high biodiversity plus all the feedbacks in it. So that's really good. The only thing is, it's almost impossible to spend 4 billion euro within a legislation period. So let's hope that we can get rid of this money for a good purpose. Okay, with this I would like to thank you and everyone else who has contributed to all the work I've presented today. Thank you.